Good evening. Thank you for coming out on this wet evening. I am Rachel Bortnick, the president of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. And this is truly a historical evening. I want to thank Joel Brooks and the American Jewish Congress for co-sponsoring. That's Joel over there. For co-sponsoring this event with us and putting in a lot of work and contacting the speakers and all that. So I want to present to you our program chairperson, Nancy Lubar, who will, I think, introduce the speakers, right? Nancy.
Actually, I will start and then, where's Gertrude? Okay. I just wanted to tell you about a few more programs coming up. On February 8th, we're having a fundraiser at Howard Wachowski's home in honor of Jerry and Robert Beer.
Yeah.
On March 3rd, with the American Jewish Congress and the JCC, we have a program about local Jewish women making waves. It may be called something else, but that's the title I like. May 13th, again with American Jewish Congress, JCC, Hadassah, and VOA, a salute to Dallas veterans of the Israeli Defense Forces. So some interesting programs coming up for you to attend. And except for the one at the Wachowski home, they'll be here at the JCC. Gertrude.
Okay. Finally got myself together here. Welcome all you ducks who like this kind of weather. Tonight we are privileged to have not one but two speakers. And I have the honor of introducing Peter Johnson. For those of you who were here at the time, Peter Johnson was the Southwest Regional Director for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He marched with Martin Luther King, and when he came to Dallas, he says that his mentor was Rabbi Levi Olin. And I said to him, we were talking, I said, well, you know, that's nice, because, you know, a lot of rabbis, you know, wanted to help on desegregation. I said, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Peter says, oh, you mean Rabbi A.J.? I didn't know him that way. When he came here, Dallas, of course, was the kind of place, because I remember when I first came to Dallas, I got on a bus and I saw all these seats in the back and all the people standing in the front. And I thought, what's the matter? And I went and sat in the back, and everybody turned around and stared at me. That was what Dallas was like in those days. Dallas has changed very, very much. And of course, as Jim Schutze will tell you later, Dallas is one of the very few southern cities that desegregated without any violence at all. But anyway, I'd like to introduce to you Peter Johnson, who marched with Martin Luther King, with Rabbi A.J. He was very, very close with Levi Olin. This was his mentor, wasn't I tell you? And for 6 years, he was the Southwest Regional Director for 5 southwestern states. So it's much more important, I think, to hear him than me. So, Peter, would you please speak?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Do y'all mind if I pull this coat off? That's a good idea. My wife takes the tie off. Good evening to everybody, and
They can't hear back here. We don't have microphones.
Oh, no, but I want you all to hear me, so.
So if you can.
Okay, no, but I will make you hear me because I do want you all to hear me.
Okay. We might want to just take a minute out, and if those of you in the very back, to take the chairs and maybe fill in the back here. I think you'd hear better.
Building probably 50 times. I attended a lot of affairs. We've had a lot of meetings, planned a lot of strategy out here. I've done a lot of crying out here. I brought my daughter in a couple of classes to go through the museum and learned a lot of lessons about that awful, awful time in history. So I do feel comfortable with you all, and I feel at home with you all. I want to take a minute and thank Gertrude Miller. Gertrude is my friend. But more important than being my friend, Gertrude is a true soldier of justice. You know, she's always involved in something to try to make Dallas a better place for everybody. And I appreciate this invitation, but I really appreciate my friendship with you, Gertrude. And since we're here to talk about historical stuff, some years ago, I stood at the statue in South Dallas where Martin Luther King statue is with Gertrude Miller. Early one morning in January to celebrate Dr. King's birthday. There were probably 40 or 50 of us there that day. And it was Jews and Gentiles and Protestants and Catholics and blacks and whites and Hispanics and Asians and all of God's family. And Gertrude, I remember that morning for a lot of reasons, because some of the people in the community brought coffee for us and wouldn't charge us and gave us donuts and etc. But that morning, standing at Dr. King's statue, to me, is what it's all about. What it's about is bringing God's family together. That's what the Civil Rights Movement was all about. That's what all of our struggles was about. That's what it is about today. Not integrating, desegregating, or civil rights. It is about bringing the family of God together. That's our great challenge. Now, I have 20 minutes out there. Now, a lot of things I want to cover. First, I want to start there. There are some people here who have got to actually stand up and let me say hello to them and let you know how much I appreciate them coming. And first four of them are sitting together. One of them, all four, this is Mr. and Mrs. Saul, that is love them to death. These Rose and Rosie and Saul, they've been a part of our ongoing effort to make Dallas a better place ever since I come to this part of the country. Sitting next to them, I've left you all to stand, is Imam Yahya Abdul. He's the Muslim minister. Sitting next to him is my brother, Muslim. Now, these two brothers are Muslims. They're Muslims who believe in justice, in equality, in decency, and fair play, and they're deeply religious. I've been sick, so they've been calling me because they're working on a project of race and reconciliation. And I asked them to come out here tonight because I wanted you all to see them. They are working to bring the metropolitan area, the whole metroplex together on the issue of race and reconciliation. And I want them to know that I support you all out there. I mean, anything you want me to do, I'm here to do it for you all on that issue. Now, that's my housekeeping. I got one other thing I want to do. Herbert Wright, would you stand? Reverend Herbert Wright is my friend. We travel all over together. I mean,
Stand again, please, so I can...
people who know me real well know that I'm real scary. I don't like to go nowhere by myself. And I've had this friend over the years. I can just pick up the phone and say, Herbert, I got to go to Tennessee. And he would say, well, Peter, when we leaving? I said, Herbert, I've got to go out to North Dallas to the Jewish Center tonight to speak, and I don't want to go by myself. He said, well, just pick me up and I'll go with you. And I love him for it. We've traveled all over and been in some interesting situations together. And just a historical note, Herbert is a Texan from a town called Bremen, Texas. He was the first black man to play quarterback for all-white high school in Texas. Now, and I hope Herbert don't mind, can you imagine being a black high school quarterback at a high school in Central Texas, and you're the only black high school quarterback in Texas, and how many times you heard, get that nigga, man, watch that nigga, tackle that nigga. That was a reality in our lives. Now, I'm finished with my housekeeping. The way I want to deal with this is to talk about my personal memories and experiences in the civil rights movement and my relationship with Jews who worked with us in the civil rights movement. But I want to start from my childhood. I was born and raised in the Cajun part of South Louisiana. I grew up in the Bayou town, a town called Plaquemine, Louisiana, which is in Iberville Parish. It's a Catholic town. My mother was a domestic. She worked in white people's kitchens. She worked for 2 white families and 1 Jewish family. As a little boy growing up, It wasn't long before I realized that there was a difference between Jews and white people in the South. Louisiana, at that time, I'm 52 years old. When I was a little boy growing up in Louisiana, Louisiana was segregated, overtly racist and bigoted. As a little boy, I would watch the white lady bring my mama home in the evening, and my mama would be sitting in the back of the car as far up in the corner to the back as she possibly could from the white lady who was driving, sitting on this side driving. But now, when the Jewish lady would bring her home, the Jewish family was the Durnings. They owned the Brown Derby outside of New Orleans when I was a boy growing up. When Mrs. Durning would bring her home, Mrs. Durning had a big, long black Buick fold-up. When she would bring her home, my mama would be sitting on the front seat, and her and Miss Durning would be cutting up and giggling and gossiping about other people's business. And when I would see that black car turn, I knew I needed to run and get in the house because Miss Durning had some chocolate in that car for us. I knew somewhere in that big black car there was some chocolate that she had brought for us, because every time she brought Mama home, she brought the children chocolate. Now, that family has remained a part of my life. My parents are dead. But the children that my parents raised are just like my brothers and sisters. They're Jews. They're the Dreyfus and the Durnings. We grew up together. When the Durnings would go on vacations every year, they would take us. See, I went to Pikes Peak when I was 8 years old. I was growing up color shirt than you know. When I was 8 years old, I went to Pikes Peak with that family, with our family. So I've had a long and historic relationship with American Jews. My father was the founder of the Louisiana Voters League. He was the first president of the NAACP in Louisiana. He was the wishful master of the Prince Hall Masons. I grew up in a family where my father was deeply involved in the problems of our people. My father was a leader. When I was a little boy growing up, Roy Wilkins and Thurgood Marshall used to stay at my house. When they would come to South Louisiana, they couldn't stay at hotels because they were segregated. I have pictures of me sitting on Thurgood Marshall's lap when I was a little boy. Long as I can remember, I've known something about segregation, the problems of race, and that something needed to be done. I got involved directly in the civil rights movement during the student set-in movement as a young student. Went to work for something called the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. CORE was founded in the 40s by a man named James Farmer and some Jews. James Farmer is still living. He's blind and bedridden. I would like to see some blacks and some Jews go to James Farmer and record the history of CORE. Let me tell you why. Jim Farmer is the last one alive from the original Big Four. Martin Luther King, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, and James Farmer. And the other man who was involved with him was a Jewish man named Walter Russo, who was over the United Auto Workers. Jim Farmer is the last one left alive. Jim probably knows more about black and Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement than anybody else. And it would be a shame to allow Jim to take his knowledge to the grave with him. Now, I made some notes, but I don't want to just talk. I want to move right quickly with you all. When I got into the civil rights movement, our first big effort was the student set-in movement. The student set-in movement was black students and college campuses in the South. Our support was Jewish students and liberal white students in the North. Students at Brandeis and other schools, that's where our support came from those white schools and from Jewish students who came down to the South to support us. So the student set-in movement, very important in the context of the civil rights movement. Jews were there and Jewish students were there. From the student set-in movement, we went to the Freedom Rides. Now what happened was, a lot of us had got kicked out of college and couldn't go back to school. So when the Wexler family, a Jewish family from New York involved in coffee, decided to underwrite the Freedom Rides, they said that they would hire students to ride them buses. Well, most of us had been kicked out of college anyway, so it seemed like a good idea. I want to back up for a minute and tell you, one of the things I learned from the Dunning family as a boy growing up was that Jews were pranksters. Jews had this weird sense of humor and was always playing jokes on people. One of the things I remember about that during those years is Mr. Dunning, who ran the Brown Derby, had an awfully vulgar mouth. He was always cussing. My mother had an awfully vulgar mouth. So they got along just fine. Both of them had nasty mouths. They'd always talking nasty and cussing each other out. But Mr. Dunning was a prankster. He was always playing jokes on my mother. And I remember one year when we were children, the Dunnings had got a puppy for their daughter Ann. Ann is my age now. She and I are the same age. And Ann had this beautiful little puppy. Well, my mother had made it very plain, loud to everybody, that she was not cleaning up behind that puppy. And she said, I'm not cleaning up no dog, you know what? And if y'all want, you need to get somebody else to come in and clean up. I'm not cleaning up no dog stuff. So Mr. Durden, what he done, well, he went out somewhere and found this fake dog poop. Sprayed it all over the house. Just make my mama just go completely left on him. You know? So cause when mama comes to the house and look at that dog poop, everywhere she goes, look at some dog poop, she just get to cussing and screaming and say that she quit, she's not gonna clean up no dog poop. And of course Mr. Durden thought that was the funniest thing in the world to do that too. So, and I wanted to, because the humor of Jews comes to play in the civil rights movement. Now, in the civil rights movement, you worked in teams. Nobody could go nowhere by themselves, so you had a team. My first teammate was a Jewish boy named Brendan Sexton. Brendan went to Brandeis. He was Walter Reuther's nephew. Brendan came south in 1963 to work in the civil rights movement with us. First time we went to jail together was we had gone to Plaquemine, Louisiana, my hometown, to have gumbo that my mother and my grandma had made for us, because we were on our way to Mississippi in 1963. This was the summer of 1963. And when we left my mother's home, we had to cross the Mississippi River, a ferry boat. Now you got to realize we have 3 carloads of civil rights workers, blacks and whites and Jews, on the segregated ferry boat in South Louisiana. Well, when Brendan Sexton realized that the ferry boat was segregated, he just said, well, we need to get out and use the colored bathroom, and y'all use the white one. Well, I thought it was a good idea because the ferry boat was at that time in the middle of the Mississippi River. So I know that you can't turn this boat around in midstream. I grew up on this river. I know a whole lot about it. So we all got out of our cars, and when we got out of our cars, the ferry boat full of people, all the white people started getting out the cars, and there was some Negro people, is what we would call at that time on the ferry boat. They came up and said, y'all. And of course, we began to use the facilities. The whites and the Jews using the black facilities and the blacks using the white facilities. That may be amusing today, but that was a bloody, bloody experience on that ferry boat. Take my word for it. Jews on that ferry boat, Mike Lesser was on that ferry boat. Michael was a PhD professor from the University of California at Berkeley. Mike got a fractured skull on that ferry boat. They did turn the ferry boat around in midstream, and we could see the sheriff's cars coming on the other side of the river as the boat began to head back. And of course they beat us and arrested us, drug us off that ferry boat and beat the hell out of us and put us all in jail. This is my hometown. My father came to get me out of jail. And I explained to Daddy that unless you can get all of us out of jail, Dad, I can't get out of jail. Brendan Sexton said, we need not worry, because I've called my uncle, and he's going to send us some lawyers. 2 or 3 days later, a cadre of Jewish lawyers invaded my hometown, led by a Jewish lady named Beverly Azaroff. These names, I want y'all to try to remember these names, because these are historical. Beverly Azaroff defended the Panthers in California. This was Bobby Seals' lawyer. This was a Jewish lawyer who taught at the law school out in California. Beverly came south along with 3 or 4 other Jewish lawyers and began to do what it would take to get us all out of jail. And we eventually got all of us got out of jail in Plaquemine. But that was the beginning of what is called the Louisiana story in regarding civil rights. Those Jewish kids, Michael and Brendan and all of them, decided to stay in South Louisiana with us for a year or 2. Now let me go back to what kind of sense of humor Brendan Sexton had. Plaquemine is the county seat of the parish seat, where the courthouse is, where we'd have to take people to register to vote. In that courthouse were colored and white signs. Of course, I had been seeing them colored and white signs all my life. They really didn't rub me the wrong way, but they just rubbed Brendan, and he just couldn't stand it. So Brendan had told me one night that he thought what we needed to do was to switch them signs around. It wouldn't take nothing but a screwdriver to switch them around. You could have all the colored folks drinking white water, all the white folks drinking colored water, all the colored folks going to the white bathroom. It seemed like a good idea to me at the time. So with screwdriver in hand, we slipped in the courthouse, began to switch them signs around. This is 1963. It's amusing now. They tried to give us 15 years for that here. See, not only did they prosecute us, find us guilty, but if it don't be for a federal judge named E. Gordon West, because we were able to get this case into a federal court, and E. Gordon West was the federal judge who said that the state of Louisiana was economically stupid trying to have dual systems poor as this state is. But the state of Louisiana convicted us, gave us 15 years for that. For destroying, they said we were destroying public property. And all we done, nobody would tell you, all we were doing was switching signs around. But I knew then that Brendan Sexton had this weird sense of humor. And had to keep an eye on him. There's a parish in Louisiana called Tangipahoa Parish. The parish seat is St. Francisville, if I remember, right on the Mississippi border. Now, this was my territory, so Brendan and I, we were developing voter registration projects in all those parishes. So we had gone up to Tangipahoa Parish one day to look at the parish and look at the courthouse and see how difficult it would be, and to meet with some of the local ministers and etc. The Tangipahoa courthouse had segregated parking, colored parking to the rear. Now when Brendan saw this, see, that didn't bother me, but when Brendan saw it, a light went off in his head. He said, Peter, this is an opportunity here. I said, what you think? Well, first we got to drive back to Baton Rouge. So we got back in the car and drive all the way back down to Baton Rouge. Brendan goes to Hertz Rent-A-Car, rents a white Lincoln photo and a black Lincoln photo. He drives the black car, puts it on. He drives the white car, puts it on the black parking lot, the colored parking lot. I drive the white car and put it on the white parking lot. Brendan explained to the judge he thought they didn't want the cars segregated. He said, I thought y'all wanted the cars up there. I thought you wanted all the white cars back there and all the colored cars up there. You know, that's funny to them, but it wasn't funny to them. See, that was not, see, at that time, that was not funny. And at that, by that time, Brendan was costing the movement money. So I was beginning to get inquiries from Andrew Young, who was my boss, saying when I see him, you know, Brendan keep getting put in jail for foolishness. Switching signs around, playing little jokes on that crazy judge down there. Y'all got to cut this out. I said, well, Andy, it's not me, it's Brendan. He said, well, you in charge? I said, but his ideas seem to be such great ideas at the time. Brendan and I worked together from 1963 up until 1966. Brendan would eventually die from a weird disease, but he was one of my dearest and serious friends in the civil rights movement. In 1964, we had a meeting in a place called Waverly, Mississippi, and we organized something called COFO, the Congress of Federated Organizations. This is where all of the students from all of the civil rights organizations got together, from SNCC and CO and NAACP and SCLC, and organized this confederation of organizations to invade Mississippi. And that's what we done. We went into Mississippi that summer, idealistic, believing in good, to do good. I was working in an area called the Delta of Mississippi. Working in Philadelphia, which is in the Shelby County, if I remember correctly, and that flat area of Mississippi. And we had gotten in some trouble in Jackson. So we had to go to Jackson to go to court. While we were in Jackson, I had a girlfriend going to Jackson State. So I thought, well, you know, since we didn't get put in jail, let's spend the night. So I can see my little girlfriend, and we can go back to the Delta tomorrow. Well, I was with some other fellows who were all a part of this with us. A boy named Andrew Goodman, a boy named Michael Shannon, a black kid named James Schutze. This history is real important because there's blood among our people. Andy Goodman, James Schutze, and Michael Shannon decided to go back to the Delta that night. I stayed. Me and Kenny, my little cousin, and Spiver, we decided to stay in Jackson that night, hang out with the girls at Jackson State. I can remember just like it was yesterday, when we were told, well, what time did they leave? We said, well, they left before dark. We had an argument about whether or not we ought to go, and we was going to catch the Continental bus the next morning, but they left before they should have been there. So they never got here, Pete. Well, what happened? Most of you all know what happened. I don't need to tell you what happened to them. But what I want to tell you is that the history is important among our people, that this is special history. Jewish children ought to know who Andrew Goodman was and why he gave his life. Black children who will study black history ought to know who Michael Shannon was and why Michael is dead today, what he died doing, why he died, why his blood was shed on that dusty road down there in the Delta of Mississippi. Now I want to get to Dallas. Dallas, Texas, a unique and peculiar community. Texas was not a part of our struggle. We didn't invade Texas as we did Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana and the rest of the southern states. So things in Texas, there's no movement towns in Texas. There's no civil rights movement towns in the state of Texas. So it was very difficult for blacks and liberals and Jews to move forward in the Dallas community. And there's some giants, I mean, the Haberzell family, Harmon Shelps and Julia Shelps, Stanley Marcus, who still living here with us. To make this part of the country move forward, it took some giants because in this part of the country, you didn't have the Martin Luther King pushing for change. When the Civil Rights Movement spread across the South, there was something in Dallas called the Citizens Charter Association. Now what they've done, they sent some white boys across the South to study what we were doing and to come back to Dallas and make sure that never did happen in their city. So they came back, and the word I want you to understand about Dallas is co-opt. See, what they've done to blacks in the city of Dallas, they co-opt the leadership. Now, today's black leadership is a reflection of that problem. In the other parts of the South, the kinds of confrontations and other things that happen here, see, we don't have that happening in other cities in the South because the black leaders in other cities in the South developed certain skills because the change that took place, they had a hands-on involvement. Here, give you an example of what I'm talking about. The meeting to desegregate Birmingham was held at the 52nd Street Baptist Church, black preachers and black leaders. The meeting to desegregate Dallas was held at a building downtown by white people in the Citizens Charter Association. They decided what Negroes were going to be involved, what they was going to do, and how long it was going to take. So you have black leaders that today in this part of the country who still suffering from the kind of confrontation neurosis of 30 years ago, because they did not have the kind of hands-on involvement. They didn't learn the negotiating skills and the working skills to work together with people to accomplish a common goal that we learned all over the South other than here. And we got some real problems here. Now, I came here in 1969. I was the first legitimate civil rights worker to be sent to the Southwest. Before I got to the Southwest, to Dallas, I had talked to Levi Olin on the telephone. Rabbi Olin was Martin Luther King's friend. Did y'all know that? Rabbi Olin is the man who invited Martin Luther King to Dallas to speak. When the black preachers boycotted Martin Luther King, Levi Olin is the man who brought him here to speak. There's another gentleman in this city, Jewish gentleman, who happens to be a rabbi. I met him in 1962 in Albany, Georgia. In Albany, Georgia, when Dr. King was leading a demonstration, something wonderful happened. Jewish rabbis from the north came to Albany, Georgia to join us. One of those young Jewish rabbis, who isn't so young no more, was Jordan Offside. Did y'all know that? Jordan and I have been friends since I was young and good looking when I met Jordan Offside. Jordan came to Albany, Georgia to march and to demonstrate and go to jail with us in 1962 when it was not popular. That's why I love it. Jordan Offside has a letter, personal letter, from Martin Luther King to him, thanking him for coming to Selma, that he kept. He gave me a copy, I got a copy of it that Jordan made me have. But Jordan has his personal letter that Dr. King sent him, thanking him for coming to Albany. Real history. Real history of blacks and Jews involvement together in the civil rights movement. When I first came to Dallas, Dr. King was already dead. I was sent here to develop the premiere showing of the movie Montgomery to Memphis, the story of Dr. King's life. Where did that movie come from? A Jewish producer in California named Sam Livingston came to Coretta King and said, I want to do something for Dr. King. I'm a producer. He said, why don't you let me put together a movie on his life? Mrs. King said, well, I don't know. He said, well, let me show you what I'm talking about. 2 or 3 weeks later, Sam came back down to the South, brought Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte with him, and outlined to Mrs. King what they wanted to do. In 6 months, we had the movie, King, Montgomery to Memphis. Now, Dallas, Texas. The movie was going to premiere in 800 cities all over the world. We chose Dallas because of Love Field. See, Love Field was the airport that I could get to Oklahoma City and Houston. All over the Southwest was accessible. That's the only reason I got to Dallas, because we felt that Love Field would make me accessible to the rest of the Southwest. 799 cities in the world embraced the movie. There was only one city who fought against the showing of the movie. Dallas, Texas. Only city in the world. I had been here 2 or 3 days before I came out to talk to Rabbi Olin. He told me, be very, very careful, young man, in this city. I didn't come here to stay. I was going to be here for 3 months until the end of the movie. But because they fought so hard against the showing of the movie here, we charged $5 for being late now. Y'all know Reverend Stovall, $5 for being late, Charles. Reverend Charles Stovall is the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference here in Dallas, and I just love him for coming out with us. Rabbi Olin was one of our strongest supporters. And I came to Rabbi Olin. You see, I didn't have no control over when the movie was going to premiere, so I came to him 2 or 3 days before the movie and told him, I said, Rabbi Olin, we got every city in the Southwest tied up and ready but Dallas. The theater owners in Dallas refused to let us show the movie. Gordon McClendon was his name, I think, on this year's here. They said, well, ain't gonna show that nigga move in this city. This is what the mayor told me. They said, may stir up the colored people. This is 1969 now. Levi Olin told me, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna get a meeting and let some of the Dallas citizens, leading citizens, do the movement. I said, well, you know, Rabbi Olin, I can't do that because I don't have access to the movie. Mrs. King will not let the movie out until it premieres. He said, well, we're going to have to do something to get this movie forward. He set up a meeting with the leaders of the city of Dallas at Park City Baptist Church. Now, that was a 40-minute version of the movie, condensed version. But that version was up in New York City. So, okay. That was a Jewish airline pilot. Flew for Brandon Airlines. He said, well, Peter, if you can get the movie down to the airport, I can put it in the cockpit and fly it down to Dallas for you. I'm going to be up there tonight. So that's how we got the 40-minute version down here to show to the Dallas leaders so they could bless it. Because that's what it was going to take. It wasn't going to be shown here. Okay, now I've been told I got to end my time.
No, you got 1 minute.
I got 1 minute. I got 1 minute. Well, no, I got to move to something else because one of the things I have to talk about when I come to talk to people is I have my own propaganda. So I need to spend a minute and tell you about my propaganda. One of the things that in all sincerity, is those of you who know me know that that there are two important things that we must deal with in our society: guns and violence. Yeah? Guns and violence. Guns and violence, and this ain't got nothing to do with our history. This has to do with contemporary problems that we must face every day. There's a proliferation of violence in our society. Ain't nobody safe, because everybody got a gun. So now listen. In this city where we live, the city of Dallas allows gun shows at the Dallas Convention Center. You can get out of the penitentiary tonight, go to a gun show at the city on city property and buy your AK-47, no questions asked. Gun shows aren't covered by the Brady Bill. That's one problem regarding guns. Now I know a lot of you all voted for the mayor because of the color of his skin. Y'all know that's wrong, yeah? Those of you all who voted for him because of the color of his skin, I want you to know that that's wrong. You know in your hearts that's wrong. See, we fought against doing that. You see, we've got to grow out of that. Now we've got these people with the right color, but they're on the wrong side of the issue. Yeah? Guns and violence, and this city's proliferation of guns. If you want to know what's going on with anti-Semitic thinking in America, go to a gun show on city property and get some of the pamphlets. Yeah? Now, everybody has published their list of issues for 1998, the mayor, everybody. Nobody has guns and violence on it as priorities. That's my priority. My second priority is race and racial harmony. Nobody wants to talk about this. This has to be a priority. Let me tell you something. Let me tell you why. There's something in the world called ethnic cleansing. Y'all ever heard of that? Yeah. That's why we got to do something about racial disharmony in this country. Because looming on the horizon is something called ethnic cleansing. So we've got to bring the races together in this society, and especially in this city. Now, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I wish there was a whole lot. Roger Kallenberg is here. I asked Roger to come. Roger and I have been friends and picketing and marching and going to jail for almost 30 years. When I first came here, there was 3 Jewish ladies, Erna Block, Angela Gershwin, and Jody Nensel. Let me tell you something. Jody Nensel is dead today. Jody Nensel, every picket sign, every banner, she was an artist. These were housewives, Jewish housewives, who was in the SCLC office every day, helping. And every march and every demonstration. Jody has a child named after me, Peter. Peter is a tall young man now, you know. But Peter was, when Peter was a little baby, he was over there in South Dallas. Every barbershop knew him because he just ran the community with us. These are people who was instrumental in bringing about changes. I believe the greatest thing that I've done in this part of the country was the hunger campaign that brought about the North Texas Food Bank. The chairman of the research committee was a Jewish lady named Elaine Thorough. the research committee, and all of the research for hunger and malnutrition. Elaine's research was so powerful that Senator Frank Church, who's dead now, Senator Church was the chairman of the committee in Washington, D.C. over hunger and malnutrition. The research that was used to develop the food stamp program and all of the federal programs, Elaine Thurrock, that was her research. Right here in this city. She's a PhD social worker, Elaine is. There are many, many, many Jewish people that was involved with us and that has been involved with us over the years. And I just want to take a minute to let you know that it ain't over. We must continue to work together. And a lot of you all remember the confrontation that Charles and I had over Khalif Muhammad, I think was his name, using racial epithets regarding Paul's fielding. I want you all to know that racial epithets are wrong, no matter what color the mouth is that it comes out of. There's a Martin Luther King taught us about right and wrong. And you see, if you're black and have bigotry in your heart, you're wrong. If you're white and have bigotry in your heart, you're wrong. If you're Jewish and have bigotry in your heart, you're wrong. We must stand together against evil. I don't want to get caught standing by myself no more, Yak Yak. I didn't like that experience at all. But that was something that had to be done. There are great challenges before us in this city. And in order for us to move this city ahead, we must work together. God bless you all. Sam Livingston, who was a Jewish producer out in Hollywood, he got the distributor out in Hollywood who distributed movies to send a telegram to all of the movie owners in Dallas saying if you don't let the Martin Luther King movie be shown, you're not getting any more movies out of Hollywood. That's how we got it shown.
He is an award-winning investigative reporter, commentator, and author. He was born in Virginia in 1946. Grew up in Michigan. In fact, was wondering why we thought tonight was a bad night. He said this was Jim was educated at St. Paul's School and University of Michigan. He began his journalism career as a police reporter for the Detroit Free Press, where he was later a feature writer and investigative reporter. In 1978, he joined the Dallas Times-Herald, where he headed up an investigative team. Jim won the Amos Tuck Award for Public Service Reporting, the Headliners Award for Investigative Reporting, and several Associated Press awards. Naturally, he later became a columnist and a member of the Times-Herald editorial board. In 1986, Jim published his first book, The Accommodation, The Politics of Race in an American City. Local Dallas business leaders tried to have the book suppressed. This is 1986. The resulting flap was reported by the New York Times, Times and Newsweek magazines, National Public Radio, and all 3 TV networks. Jim's area of focus in recent years has been crime, particularly youth crime. He is the author of 5 nonfiction true crime books. 2 of them have been nominated for the Edgar Award by Mystery Writers of American Association. A 1993 network TV movie, Black Widow Murders, was based on his book, Preacher's Girl. His most recent book, Bully, has been called by the New York Times an indictment of suburban values. In addition, Jim has been involved in the development of dozens of film projects, both for feature and television movies. Please join me in welcoming Jim Schutze.
Boy, that sounds good. I always tell people I helped make the Dallas Times-Herald what it is today. Part of the team. I came here in 1978 from Detroit at a time when Detroit had just elected its first black mayor, Coleman Young. the politics of the city council were such that the question was whether you could be elected if you were an avowed Marxist or if you were just sort of an in-the-closet Marxist. And there were two on the council who were avowed, and I forget what the rest of the breakdown was. But Detroit was a very different place from Dallas. I won't, my reasons for coming here were personal and professional, but anyway, I got here and sensed right away that I had made some kind of major change in my life, and I wasn't sure whether it was a good one or a bad one. One of the first things I attended here as a reporter was some kind of county Democratic Party function, and as I remember, it was to announce that the guy whose name was the same as a president, he was the county treasurer, Warren Harding, was going to run for re-election. And so I figured, okay, a Democratic Party function, I know what these are like. And I went, and the first thing that struck me was that everyone in the room was white, except for the people working there, serving coffee and so on. Then, after I'd been there for a while, a black man entered the room with his wife. That was the Reverend Ira Loud, who's no longer living, right? So, I guess I wouldn't tell this story if he were. But he entered the room, and it was his role to give the invocation. And he came, and there was an area, a kitchen area, that had like a fence or a barricade around it. He and his wife went into the kitchen area and sat and sipped coffee. Then when it was time for him to give the invocation, he came out and gave the invocation, and then he went back into this area. And I've been here from Detroit for 4 days, and I'm watching this, trying to figure out exactly what's going on. And so finally I asked somebody, why is he, how come he's sitting in the kitchen? And they said, well, Reverend Loud prefers to maintain a certain separation. And that's how it is here. This is a very conservative community. So I started trying to sort of run that math through my head. And then immediately I began to get the story about Dallas, the only city in the South that desegregated without violence. And this story was always told to me in a tone or with a purpose of explaining that Dallas was a very advanced place. That Dallas was ahead of other cities in the South because it had not suffered the same upheaval that other places had in the 60s. And then this math that I was trying to work in my head was getting more and more complicated, because all the evidence of my eyes was that Dallas was way behind the curve in terms of race relations. And yet the story that I was told was that it was a very rational place that was ahead of the game. And I kept hearing this story over the next 10 years. I had a lot of friends, white colleagues who moved here from the Northeast and elsewhere, who seemed to get off the plane and say, boy, this place is really backward racially. This place is really behind the times. And then in the next few weeks, it was as if they would get down and kiss the ground and say, I'm home at last. And there would be this noticeable regression in their own values and behavior. Sort of the pressure of liberalism was lifted from them, and they could return to their innermost feelings. In 1984, Dallas hosted the Reagan re-election convention. And this was at a time when Dallas was booming, of course, and Dallas was a big center of ultra-conservative fundraising. And it was sort of a darling of the far-right wing of the Republican Party. At the convention, Reverend Criswell, First Baptist, gave a long invocation which turned into sort of a speech in which he made reference to the Dallas story of the official Dallas story of Dallas as the city that desegregated rationally and without violence. And then he said that this explained why things were so much better in Dallas than elsewhere in terms of the race relations and diversity and so on. And there was a suggestion that the rest of the country should really have done things the Dallas way and might want to think about trying to recover some of that ground, which I found to be a very, very dangerous idea. I mean, by then I'd been in the city 6 years, and it was clear to me that a whole lot of work just hadn't been done here. This was before I met Peter, and before I had any understanding of what the civil rights movement history of the city had been. I now know the civil rights movement history of the city was Peter, and not a lot else. That's not to say that's sometimes interpreted as meaning that black people in Dallas were very apathetic. To jump ahead in my story, I wound up being kind of commissioned by a local publishing house to write a book that was a history of racial politics in the city. And since I wasn't here for that history, one of the things I tried to do was go back and read the newspapers of the period, both the Times-Herald and the News. I found that there was in fact a pattern of small explosions and uprisings. A lot of them had to do with the sign on the buses and the trolleys. The sign, I had to have somebody explain this to me, but the sign was movable. And it was supposed to depend on how many black people needed seats and how many white people needed seats. But of course, the sign would get left shoved up against the back. So there would be black people standing, and there would be seats open in the front. And especially black women who had worked all day in somebody's house and were headed home and didn't want to have to stand up would wind up just going and sitting in those seats. And sometimes it would pass, and sometimes it would not. And when it didn't, there were these little mini riots where the bus driver would come back and say, "You people have got to get out of these seats," and the black people would refuse. And some of them were apparently pretty good riots, according to the news accounts. I figure anything that attracts, in the year 1958, that attracts over a dozen police cars is a pretty good-sized uprising. So the fact was, or the evidence was, that segregation always chafed, and it always made people mad, and there were always these incidents where people got angry enough to simply refuse to go along with it. There was another, as a journalist, I was interested to see how this was reported in the papers. The Dallas, the Times-Herald, which was the more blue-collar but also somewhat more liberal paper, would say that, would simply not report the incident rather than make trouble. And the morning news, the more conservative paper, would always have a story saying that the incident had not occurred. Those reports were often very useful to me because they were very detailed. The report of an incident at Hatcher and 8th last night at 8 p.m. on such and such a radio station was false. 12 police cars were not called. And there were ways I could go back around and sort of reestablish some of those facts. The big story I came across in doing this research, which no one had mentioned to me, in the story of how Dallas desegregated peacefully, was the story of the bombings in South Dallas in the early 50s, which were pretty scary. They were organized. This was at a time when black veterans were coming back with enough money and wherewithal to afford decent housing. There was none available for them in black neighborhoods. And there had been changes in the law. I forget what those covenants are called, deed restrictions, had been knocked down by the Supreme Court. So black people could now legally move into so-called white neighborhoods, and they were doing so because that's where the available housing was. And there was this organized campaign of bombing directed against those families. There was a blue ribbon grand jury, so-called, which interestingly enough consisted of the members of the Dallas Citizens Council, who were deemed a blue ribbon grand jury. And I interviewed Mr. Wade, Henry Wade, about this at a time when he still remembered it clearly. And he said, well, hell, that was probably all illegal, but that's just how we did things here. And this grand jury investigated and seemed to find, according to the news accounts, that the bombings were not only organized and funded from a central source, but that this central source was close to or parallel to an association of white churches in South Dallas. There's a moment at which these stories simply disappeared from both newspapers. And eventually a couple of the thugs who were doing the bombing were tried and acquitted. Henry Wade told me that the feeling at the time was that the bombings, that the signal had been sent, the bombings had stopped, that was enough. There was no point in pushing it. Those bombings are very clearly etched in the memory of the people who suffered them. I interviewed a woman in South Dallas who remembered being in her bed, her husband was in bed, the back of the house was blown off, and her husband's leg was severed at the knee. And as they got up and sort of looked around and figured out what was going on, 3 Dallas police officers appeared in the smoke with lights. Said, is there everybody alive in here? And they said, yes, we're alive. And they said, well, we've called an ambulance, and the fire trucks are on the way. And then they disappeared. So that woman always assumed that the police officers had arrived with the bombers. And there was some indication in the newspaper accounts at the time that this could possibly be true. All of that history was so disturbing because of, there are people, I discussed this with Comer Cottrell, whom some of you may know is a prominent black business leader in the community, but Mr. Cottrell didn't come from here. I think he was in California, but I think he grew up in Mobile, in Alabama. And he said, well, those bombings happened everywhere in the South. That doesn't make Dallas unique. What makes Dallas unique is that the story was so sealed away and hidden. When I got done with my book, it took me about a year. It was a strange kind of rush job. And one of the things I had to do in order to prepare to come here was to go back and look at that book, which is not one of my favorite pastimes. It's been 10 years. There are some big holes in it. But when it was completed, the problem was that it was clear that there might be an effort to suppress it. And in fact, more names are just going right out of my head. I'm sure it has to do with the weather or something. The guy who was the executive director for the Citizens Council, Alex Bickley, this book was to be published by Taylor Books, which had always done high school yearbooks before. And they'd been purchased by a national company. Times were flush, and some idiot talked them into doing trade books. Worst idea they ever had. But mine was to be their first trade book. And Alex Bickley went to Taylor Publishing the day my book was on the press. For one thing, in the publishing world, press time is so valuable that, once you're on the press, that's it. There's no going back. He persuaded them to pull the page plates off the press. And his argument was that if this story got out, that if this book was published, revisiting all of these difficult moments, black people would learn about them, and there'd be trouble. Of course, and what that did was create a very unfortunate, for me, impression in the black community that I knew something. And there was this great, eventually there was a publisher in New Jersey who published the book. But there was this great anticipation in the black community because people figured if the Citizens Council killed Schutze's book, he must have really figured something out. This has got to be a great book. And I'm afraid there was a great wave of disappointment. People read the book in the black community and said, well, we know all this. You know, we lived through this. This happened to us. The point was, for me, that the white community not only didn't know it, but told this very obverse kind of story, which was that Dallas had been a place of milk and honey and peace, and that these problems had not occurred here. Part of the history that was compelling to me had to do with the relationship between the Jewish community and the African American community in Dallas. I don't know how much. Okay, so I knew if I got to
Equal time, equal
I
time.
knew if I said I'd get to my topic, you'd give me a couple more minutes. There are a bunch of key moments along the way. One of them is the period after the Kennedy assassination, when the impression you can't help coming to is that the conservative Gentile community, or some elements of it, went to New York, went to Los Angeles, traveled around the world after the Kennedy assassination, and came back with a great sense of shock and said, people are mad at us about this. This isn't playing well in the world. There's always been a yin and yang, I think, between the Gentile business leadership and the Jewish business leadership, which used to be more separate communities. The interesting thing about Dallas is that both have the same roots and the same kind of bones in the place and in business, and there's a sense of a kind of power sharing. And my impression of the period after the Kennedy assassination is that Gentile leadership went to people like Rabbi Olin, went to Sam Bloom and others, and said, what are we going to do about this image problem that we seem to have because of the assassination? And to the credit of the Jewish leaders who agreed to sort of help with that issue, they said, this is not an image problem, this is a morality problem. And the movie that Sam Bloom produced, another movie that was shown around the city prior to the desegregation of the schools, for example, Felix McKnight of the Times-Herald, I was so proud to see him in this movie, and he and other people stand up in the movie and say, Dallas must desegregate because it's the right thing to do. I think that was a difficult message, and there was a lot of pressure at the time to say, why don't we say we should desegregate because it's the smart thing to do? And to the credit of the sort of Jewish voice in that movie and in those times, the moral message came across strongly. There are other uncomfortable moments in that history. There's the history of the League movement, which was not a Jewish movement, but the Jewish community was important to it. There was also a TI technology element. There were a lot of people who'd moved here and who said, these schools are abysmal, and we've got to do something about it. It's amazing how far back the school issue goes here. In the League movement, there was an attempt to bring new cadres of voters to the fore and to the question. And there was an attempt to sort of activate the black community. However, when it came to the point of when the black community said, okay, we're here, we've voted, we've supported, we've done all that stuff now, here's our black candidate for the school board. We want your support. The Jewish leadership that was involved, along with the Gentile leadership and all the other people who were involved in the movement, pulled back and said, we're not ready for that. Your candidate is a postal worker. He's just not, he's not the right caliber for what we think needs to be on the city council. that moment stuck and is keenly remembered. The people involved in it were Elsie Faye Higgins and J.B. Jackson. In that general circle of people, a little later on, there was this kid from Forney who was a judge's clerk, John Wiley Price. I mention this only to say that the record is not perfect. If you were going to hand out marks, which would be a stupid thing to do, but let's say you were going to give everybody a grade, I don't know that the Jewish community could say, we get an A for this. This is all relative, and I think a B+ might fly. And that's not bad in a city where you've got a lot of C-, you've got some E's. In fact, I was thinking on the way out here, I remember when I went to college, there was a kid, a roommate of mine, who came from a school district where they had F's. I said, what's an E? And he said, that's when you fail. I said, well, what is an F? He said, that's when you fail really badly. I think we could agree that Dallas has a lot of F's. It has sort of an F community out here, probably. But given the times and given the difficulties the city faces now, I guess I think it's important for all of us to remember that this has been a strange city, a difficult city, a complex place, at times a dangerous city, and we've all had our good moments and our bad moments, but nobody gets 100%. So that's my suggestion.
We have time for questions if you want to address them.
So what's happened? Why do we have, you're probably right about a B+. Why is it that this segment of the community is vilified by people like Farrakhan and this idiot that you mentioned, this Khalid Mohammed? What is it that makes this happen?
Well, I think a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is Jews are easy targets. I mean,
Talk louder, please.
I said a lot. His question was, what is going on between black and Jewish relations? What about the Louis Farrakhan's of our time? And my response was, one of the reasons I think is because I think Jews are easy targets. One of the things we learned in the civil rights movement, I had a relationship with Malcolm X, a very good relationship with Malcolm X. Malcolm and my brother who on the school board of New York, been up in New York since he got out of the Army, and he and Malcolm were hustlers together. In fact, my mama had a picture of them in zoot suits and cockadoo hats. But so I developed a pretty good relationship with Malcolm. And one of the things that we would always say to the Muslims and to Malcolm and those fellows was, it is real easy to stay up in New York, up in Boston, and talk tough and mean. But somebody at some point got to go to Mississippi and face the sheriff. See, Farrakhan can easily attack Jews and look real good to the masses of blacks because you're an easy target. But you see, Farrakhan ain't never come to Alabama and attack George Wallace.
What's that got to do with relation to Jews, though?
The Jews are easy targets because Jews was in the community.
Why don't the other blacks stand up against them?
One of the things that blacks must do, that's a very good question. In order for us to move to reconciliation, blacks have to deal with the question of forgiveness. Black leaders and black preachers have got to preach forgiveness. It is very hard to tell black leaders, we got some black leaders here today, you can't get black leaders to talk to black people about forgiveness. It is unpopular. It is very easy. If Louis Farrakhan comes to town today, he's in a limousine, he has a $1,200 suit on. I mean, he's like a rock star. So it's very difficult for everyday kind of people like me and folks to compete with this. This man will go to speak at the high school campus. He drives up in a limousine. He's got bodyguards. He got fancy clothes on, and he's very articulate. Now, I've known him probably longer than anybody in Texas. So I knew him when he was Louis X. I knew him when he used to sing at a nightclub in Atlanta, Georgia, called Le Carousel. Because y'all know that Louis Farrakhan was a nightclub performer when I first met him, singing at a club called Le Carousel and preaching on the streets of Atlanta. We used to tease him. We called him Little Malcolm. was what we called them. This is years ago, because they was against the civil rights movement. Now, when the attack on Jews took place, black leaders stuck their head in the sand. Very few of us. There is a man that stood up to him that ain't scared of him. Very few of us had enough courage to stand up and say that any attack on another ethnic group is wrong. Ethnic assassinations of each other must stop. Now, blacks and Jews, we got a common enemy called bigotry. See, we got a real common enemy called bigotry. I learned that in the early years. When they would beat us in the civil rights movement, but you know who they would beat worse than us, who they hated worse than they hated us? The Jewish kids. God, they hated them more than they hated us. I mean, sometimes I would be saved from getting a beating, because if they realized that he was a Jew, they was going to forget about beating me and beat him.
I know about that. I was raised in Catholic Boston, so I know all about that.
I have a comment and a question. I came from a country that I was born a second-class citizen. When I came to Dallas, I was 26 years old. I remember very vividly when I took the early streetcar. There was an elderly black lady sitting in the front. When she got up, and I looked at it, I didn't understand what it means. Then when I came to learn how to be a salesman, Mr. Joe was black too, and he couldn't wait on a white customer. But he showed me how to be a salesman. And then what I'm talking about now is 50 years later, living in Dallas, I still see, for instance, the Jewish community has gone out, as you mentioned, name Rabbi Olin and Mr. Bloom, and I can mention another 10, 50 of them who helped the cause of blacks. We have a black vocal, what do you call it, the vocal alcohol. That 99.9% is for homeless children, and mostly of them are black. I was out down there. And still, after 50 years, we are still the bloodsuckers, we are still the landlords, we are still the bankers, we are still, and I cannot understand why the black leaders in this community cannot stand up for some racist thing that we do against the Jews. We have something in common, and yet
I hear you very clearly, and that's why the history is so important, that we ought to record our common history and disseminate it to the next generation. When you have people like Louis Farrakhan talking about Jews involved in the civil rights movement, how the hell do you know? He don't know nothing about Jews involved in the civil rights movement because he was not there. We know about it. It is our fault that we have not recorded our common history. Are you from Germany?
No, Poland.
From Poland.
We didn't have any blacks in Poland at
That
all.
was a German Jewish man here when I first came here. He was dead now. There was Herb Kroner. Mr. Kroner was small in stature. Mr. Kroner had them numbers on him from the concentration camps, where he had been branded in the concentration camps. Now, Mr. Kroner was an old man. Herbert, you remember Herb Kroner? Mr. Kroner was in every march and in every demonstration we ever had. And Mr. Kroner, let